bruh, I don't even have an ego anymore. I've transcended my ego 20 times. And these are cumulative transcensions as well. In fact, my ego is so non-existent that I am just one with the universe. I'm just one with God. I am God, actually. Sometimes I think I am God. But then I think about it, and I say, no, God still has an ego. And when you're eventually as spiritually evolved as I am, one day, maybe one day, you can also get a peek to see what I can see right now. Bruh, here I am with my cup of shut the fuck up. And that is delicious. And it's quite hot as well. I think I just burnt my tongue. So an ego is like a mechanism that separates us from nature, essentially. So if you think about it this way, a tree doesn't have an ego because it's an inseparable part of nature. A tree is a tree. It doesn't have an identity. It doesn't have a sense of individuality. It doesn't have a personality. Humans, on the other hand, do have egos because we exist as individuals. We aren't just part of this mesh. We have identities and personalities and a sense of self. This is a big one. We have a sense of self. And if you don't have a sense of self, like not at all, then you would be a vegetable. You wouldn't have the capacity to move or to think or to do anything. The only way that you would exist without an ego is if you were on life support. But if you're watching this video, I'm going to assume that you're not on life support. So as long as you are an individual entity that has a sense of self, you have an ego. So we shouldn't make the ego out to be the enemy, because the ego is not the enemy. The ego is just a natural part of what we are. It's a mechanism. And it has a very important function as well, which is to survive, which is to live or to experience consciousness as an individual. So if your grand pursuit in life is to kill your ego and to experience reality through a lens of egolessness, then this is a fallacy, because you simply can't. Sure, I'm not saying that you can't reduce your ego, that you can't find some sort of balance where you have this equilibrium with nature and you recognize yourself as an inherent part of nature that has a purpose, that will live, that will die, like every other animal or tree or being. Because the bigger the ego gets, the more we protrude from the mesh of reality as an individual. And while this can have some benefits, generally it's not something that we desire or we want to have a big ego. And it certainly doesn't help us along our path of spiritual growth. Because if you have a big ego, then you have a big sense of self-importance. The bigger the ego, the more reality revolves around you. So instead of being just like a tiny figment of this much larger system, if you have a big ego, then you think that you are the most important thing. And it's ironic because I've met quite a few people who have gone through these profound ego death experiences, and then they come from this position of pompousness. And it's quite ironic because they tend to look down on you and say, I have transcended. I am the egoless one. I am connected to God. But no one else is, it's just me. Look at me. Guys, look at me. No, don't look over there, look at me. I'm the important one. I'm the one who needs attention and acknowledgement. I'm the one who has killed my ego, so look at me. Look at me! So it's sort of like, no, this isn't how it works. You actually have a bigger ego because you had some, I'm not saying that it wasn't a crazy, profound, maybe transcendental experience. Maybe it was. But your ego has actually bloated because of that experience. So if you sort of come from this position where you think you are connected to God and you're enlightened, or you're going through some sort of process where you think there's something special about you, then you've actually done the opposite. You've increased your ego rather than reduced it. So having a very inflated ego sort of like sucks reality into it, and you think that nothing exists but yourself. On the other hand, having a small ego is the opposite phenomenon. So you don't really have much of a sense of identity or individuality. You're more just a tiny little cog in the system, just doing your thing, and you don't really think about it. But there can also be consequences to having a small ego. You're not going to be ambitious. You're not going to have this sense of self-confidence or perhaps self-esteem that helps drive you. But of course, on the other hand, if you have an inflated ego, then you're an asshole. Even though you might have a greater sense of self-confidence, self-esteem, you might think you are the top shit and no one else matters. So you are very egocentric or self-centric, thinking that the world revolves around you. Of course, this will come back to bite you in the ass at some point. It's not a sustainable way to live. So what I'm getting at is we should be seeking a balance, to have a moderated ego. Not an ego that's too small, otherwise it will compromise some aspects of having an individual life experience where we want to make the best possible lives for ourselves, and we need to carve out these lives. But also not being an asshole, not thinking that the world revolves around you. Now that we have this framework of what the ego is, let's jump into ego death. Ego death is a phenomenon where you don't exist anymore. Although there are different means to experience this, so we can experience it through meditation, through yoga, through breath work, through many different modalities actually. Most commonly, we experience it through plant medicines, when we go right into the deep end of a plant medicine trip. So the thing is that we can have these profound experiences of ego death, but the ego always comes back. And it needs to come back, because if it doesn't come back, then you won't survive. How are you going to survive if there is no operator in your body? So let's talk a little bit about what the experience of ego death feels like. Myself, I have experienced this with psychedelics. So there are two major experiences that I recall. One was with LSD, and when this happened, I literally thought I was dying while I still had my ego. And essentially what happened is I broke down into tears. I thought I was dying. I literally thought I was dying. And I ended up surrendering to the experience. After that, it felt like everything that made me, my personality, my identity, my thoughts, my memories, my emotions, were like this handful of sand that was thrown into a hurricane. Suddenly, my consciousness was like dispersed into this system of energy. And I could still observe this system. So I can't tell you how I observed it. I can't tell you if it was in first person, in third person, if it was something else completely. But I remember seeing this like huge just whirlwind of energy, of consciousness, made from trillions and trillions and trillions of little specks of like sand, but they were white, almost like souls, creating this entire system. What happened is the experience of consciousness, whatever it was, kept going into different visions. So one was like a savanna and I was watching the food chain. One was like seeing heaven and hell. One was seeing masculine and feminine energies. One was like seeing God or like aliens, or it's a little bit vague at this point because this happened maybe like 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago actually. But it was an extremely profound experience and it was offset by a Kundalini awakening. So at the start of this experience, while I still had my ego and I still had consciousness, I went through this like Kundalini awakening, which I talked about in a different video, which I'll link here if you want to watch it. So I won't go into too much detail about this experience here, but once I surrendered, I distinctly remember this tunnel that I like shot through, and it was like, I'm gone. I did not exist anymore. There's no sensation, there's no feeling, there's no memory, there's no thought. Reality didn't exist. I didn't exist. None of this existed. And it was this crazy, crazy experience that it did feel like I was God. It felt like I knew all the secrets of the universe, or whatever I was, whatever composed my consciousness or this collective consciousness. Just like I knew everything, or it knew everything. Again, I can't tell you how I experienced this, but it was an experience somehow. But the thing about ego death is we can't stay in these states because none of this exists. Individuality, reality doesn't exist when we are experiencing ego death. And of course, if none of this exists, then we have no capacity to move our body, to think, to be. So naturally, the ego comes back, and then we reclaim our sense of identity and we say, whoa, what just happened? That was weird. And we're back to it. And I can recall another experience that I had. Like I've had quite a few experiences that I would say were close to it. I didn't know who I was or what was happening, or even it got to the border that I might not have known if I even existed at points. But there's one other experience where, so I was living in Vietnam, I bought this THC pen, and for some reason it was super strong. I took one hit of it, and then the next thing I remember is I'm in black space, but I don't have a body, I don't have memory, so I couldn't tell you what country I was in, I couldn't tell you who I was, what nationality I was, if I was a human. It was a strange phenomenon because there was still some sense of like there was still something there. I knew that I existed, but I didn't know what I was, and everything was just black. So I'm sitting there in this space and I'm like, okay, I know that something exists. I know that there is existence, but I don't really know what it is. And I was sort of on that brink of feeling uneasy about it, like, again, you're just in empty black space and you don't exist. It can be a bit of an uneasy feeling, so let's put it that way. So I obviously still had emotions, and I was lying there and I'm like, what is this? Why does nothing exist? But my thoughts still existed. I still knew that something existed. There was a sense of I that existed. And I was starting to feel uneasy about this experience, but then I was sort of reminding myself, I'm like, okay, this is temporary. I don't know where I am. I don't know what is happening, but I feel safe. I think I'm safe. I don't have any memory. I couldn't remember what humans were. I was trying to think about it because it's an interesting sensation where I was like honestly trying to think about it. I'm like, okay, what is the last thing I remember? Where was I? And I was thinking, I'm like, no, I remember literally nothing. I don't even know what this like plane of existence is, or if I'm a spirit, if I'm something else, what the hell am I? And it wasn't until some time, like I couldn't tell you if this was half an hour, maybe a little bit more. But then suddenly I started to remember that humans existed and that Earth existed. And I'm like, whoa, that was a weird dream. And I'm like, wait a second. Is it a dream, or is there something more to this? And I started thinking, I'm like, hold on, I think there is something more to this, because I know that experiences happen from people, or that there is an experience, and I started remembering like certain people, and I'm like, this feels familiar. I know this person, but how do I know this person? What am I? I still couldn't figure out what I was, or who I was, or what was going on. And I guess as the THC started to wear off, that's when it started to come back to me, and I started to reclaim my identity slowly. It was a gradual process, and remembering experiences, remembering childhood experiences. Then I remembered that, oh, wait a second, I'm an Australian. I'm an Australian, I'm one of these things. But what is an Australian? And I'm like, it's a human, we're humans as well, cool. So it started coming back, then I remembered my name, and eventually I could open my eyes, and I was sort of like back in the bedroom, in my apartment at the time. And I'm like, wow, okay, that was pretty intense. But I'm back now. And believe me, I started going easier with that THC after I had that. Because the way I sort of see it is that the ego is like a plug. And once you unplug the ego, all the water drains out and there is no separation between your individuality and everything else. What everything else is a different question entirely. So I could go into many different tangents about this. For your sake, I won't. So without an ego, you are just a part of existence, essentially. And there seems to be no defined barrier between this material existence and like spiritual levels of reality. From the collective consciousness, from the astral, from many different things are out there. All the lines become blurred because you pulled out the plug. And we can temporarily experience ego death. Not that it's necessarily an experience that you want. And it's not until after I experienced it that I'm like, yeah, I could probably chill out a little bit more and life's pretty good. I enjoy being a human. Why rush this experience of not existing? But don't get caught into this frame or this lens or this view that the ego is a bad thing and we should be trying to kill it. Because the ego is just it's a natural part of what we are and who we are. It is that mechanism. And it doesn't matter how spiritually evolved you are or how spiritually evolved anyone is, everyone still has an ego. So even though perhaps there are gurus and monks and yogis who can exist in these states of samadhi, or these states of enlightenment, we could say, where they aren't connected to their body whatsoever anymore, they're just in another dimension. I do believe that is real. I do believe people can go into these states and perhaps, their body can sustain themselves somehow, supernaturally even. But of course, while they're in this state of consciousness, they can't do anything but be in this state of meditation because there's no soul in their body anymore. Or they're just part of this collective consciousness. There is no driver, so how can they operate their body if there is no driver? Likewise, if you're aiming for permanent ego death, like so many of us spiritual gurus are, how can you drive your body if the driver doesn't exist anymore? So your body is your vehicle, it's your car. Through these modalities, through plant medicines and psychedelics and all these different things, no, we can cease to exist. Our consciousness can go bloop and experience other dimensions, or our soul can leave our body. But the car is still there. Okay, so my egoless friend. I have explained this in the best way that I know how. I hope this whole ego death thing starts making a little more sense to you. And you should realize that trying to kill it is not the way to go. Even if you successfully kill it, you probably wish you hadn't. I've come to realize that existing is actually pretty fun. I recommend it. I give it 5 out of 5 stars to exist. So continue existing, because it's a good thing to do.